I think our next speaker must have been listening to Sue's advice about the need to do more botanizing in the Tumakakuri Highlands and in the mountain ranges there. Jack Dash is going to talk with us today about the Sky Islands of Southern Arizona, and the Tumakakuri Islands and the mountain ranges that compose it are one of the Sky Islands, not quite as high as some of the more dramatic ones, but still ones that, as you can see from Sue's talk, have wonderful plants. Jack is the new vice president for the Tucson chapter of the Arizona Native Plant Society, and his day job is working at the Desert Survivors Native Plant Nursery in Tucson. So he is well equipped to tell us not only about wild plants in the wild, but native plants as you might want to put them in your gardens and urban landscapes. He's not going to talk about that today, though. Instead, he's going to tell us about the diversity in the Sky Islands. Jack is deeply involved in field work right now for his main project, his main extracurricular project, which is an annotated flora of the Atascosa Highlands, one of these Sky Islands. And so we're going to turn it over to Jack and hear what he has to say.
All right, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate being able to follow Wendy and Sue, such illustrious and amazing botanists. It's a total privilege and a pleasure. And thanks to all of you for sticking around for the last presentation of the night. So today we're going to talk about floristic diversity in the Sky Islands of Southern Arizona. And I think we have to start, though Wendy did a fantastic job of this, by just talking a little more about what is a Sky Island. So you'll hear a few different words that are or phrases that are synonymous with Sky Island. A big one will be Madrean Archipelago. That largely refers to the fact that a lot of the Sky Island region is heavily influenced by the flora, fauna of the Sierra Madre Occidental of Western Mexico, though some of the Sky Islands that are further from the border will have maybe a little bit less of this influence. Again, there's a bit of debate about what a Sky Island might be. This map kind of goes from the Pinal Mountains as its northernmost down to, I believe that's the Sierra Mazatlan towards the bottom there. You can see on the west end, the Boba Kivris are listed as the westernmost. I think you could, if you look down a little bit below those, just to the left of Nogales on my screen, you also have the Sierra El Humo, which I think could very likely be included as a Sky Island, but there will be slightly different definitions. At its core, a Sky Island is a wooded mountain range rising out of a desert scrub or semi-desert grassland base. So in other words, there will be plants and animals that can survive and thrive in stable populations at the top, which may not be able to do so at the bottom, and vice versa. And another thing to note is that the influence of several different habitat types plays a big role in the diversity of this region. And what I think makes the Sky Islands so fantastic for botanists is that, you know, of the approximately 4,000 species in Arizona, 39 to 4,000, around 2,000 to 2,100 are known to occur in the Sky Island region. So it has a huge biodiversity, supports a large percentage of the Arizona flora. Here, these two graphs are from a Moore et al. Proceedings of the Madrean Conference 2013. And when we did a practice session for this, there was a practice question that was, why do you sometimes see listings of as low as, let's say, 25 Sky Islands all the way up to 65? Well, one part of that is that some people will be solely looking at Sky Islands of Arizona and New Mexico. So if you're looking at a Forest Service map, it's not likely to include Mexican Sky Islands. If you do include those Mexican Sky Islands, obviously the number increases drastically, closer to that 65 number. Another factor is whether you're looking at individual mountains or if you're counting, let's say, Sky Island complexes. So for instance, if we look at table 1 there, I believe 6 down, we can see the Canelo Hills, which maybe you could count as their own Sky Island. I would tend to count them as more of a Sky Island complex connected to the, Huachucas, and you can kind of see that more in table 2. So one of the things we'd be looking at is, are we talking about individual mountains, for instance, Atascosa Peak, or are we looking at individual, connected mountain ranges? One important consideration for defining a Sky Island would be that it's not connected by contiguous woodland to the Sierra Madre or to the Rocky Mountains to the north. So they really are an archipelago of tall mountains surrounded by seas of desert grassland or desert scrub communities. This is a 2017 chart by Sky Jacobs. This shows some of the ecoregion influences on the Sky Islands. As you can see, to the north, we have the Rocky Mountains. To the south and east, the Sierra Madre. We get a strong neotropical influence that kind of affects especially the southernmost Sky Islands in the United States. As you get further north, you'll have more of that heavy Rocky Mountain influence. From the west, you have a strong Sonoran Desert influence. This will be particularly felt in Sky Islands like the Boabakivris, Catalinas, that are more on the west side of the Sky Island range. On the east side, so moving towards the Chiricahuas or the Animas Mountains in New Mexico, you'll feel a lot more of that Chihuahuan Desert Great Plains influence, particularly in the semi-desert grassland and kind of scrub communities that occur on that east side of the Sky Island range. And I would like to point out that in this chart, the small outline around the Sky Islands region does include the Sierra El Humo in northwestern Sonora. So again, you're going to get slightly different mountain ranges included depending on who's doing the survey. This is another Windy Moore chart here. And this gives us an interesting impression of why the Sky Islands are so diverse. Aside from those habitat influences coming from the west, east, north, and south, within an individual Sky Island, you'll get a great deal of diversity as you move up. So starting at, a basin, typically going to be desert scrub or semi-desert grassland, and they can extend up into oak woodland all the way up to mixed conifer forest. Not all Sky Islands will have all these habitat types. So for instance, Sky Islands further east or north are unlikely to have as much of a heavy desert scrub influence as those in the west. Also, not all Sky Islands will have mixed conifer forest. That's kind of reserved for some of the largest ones. It's also important to note that while this concentric ring model is really great as a visualization, things can be quite different on the ground because, of course, local topography will have a strong influence. So for instance, a south-facing canyon wall might have an extremely different flora, a north wall. So while the concentric rings are great, it gets even more complicated on the ground. It contributes to the diversity. So I'd like to start by just taking a bit of a tour up some of these regions we looked at. The first would be desert scrub. So this is a shot from Pima Canyon in the Catalina Mountains. You can see a fantastic example of desert scrub here. We have jojoba, saguaros, we have little leaf palo verde. And if you look in the bottom corner, you can actually see Bommeria hispida, which is a fantastic fern that can grow in fairly arid conditions. Now, a species I'd like to really highlight would be the Haplophyton semicidum variety Crooksii. You'll find it just as Haplophyton Crooksii in a lot of older texts. I would be happy to see this one as its own species. It's a member of the Apocynaceae, so most of us are going to be familiar with milkweeds if we're watching this evening. It's in that same family. Dwarf desert plumeria is a common name, and you can see that very plumeria-like flower, which is another member of the Apocynaceae. Also yerba de la cucaracha, because apparently this plant has insecticidal properties. So it has been used ethnobotanically for that purpose. These are beautiful flowers, similar to if you go to Hawaii and get a lei necklace, the flowers will look somewhat like this, but much larger. Here's a sign-up map of the distribution. So we can see, particularly centered in the area around Tucson, Rincons, Catalinas. It does also grow in the Tucson Mountains, which are not a Sky Island, but certainly have strong desert scrub communities. And down into Sonora, a little bit north of Hermosillo in particular. So kind of not in every Sky Island. Again, you will not see it in those as frequently in those easternmost Sky Islands that have less of a desert scrub, more of a semi-desert grassland influence, though it can be found in both communities. We can see the follicles. So again, if you're familiar with milkweeds, you've seen those pods that will dry, and very similar on this. The seeds are extremely thin and have small white plumes of hair. You can also see a habitat shot. This was taken at the base of Tumacacori Mountain, so just near Tumacacori Mission. up against a south-facing slope. So pretty hot microclimate that was kind of edging from desert scrub or even almost thorn scrub influences into semi-desert grassland. Now, one thing that wasn't included in that concentric ring chart that I think is especially relevant to some of the southernmost skylands in the United States, and certainly many of the skylands in Mexico that Sue talked about, would be this thorn scrub habitat. In this photo, we can see Lynn's favorite plant, some Erythrina flabelliformis just at the bottom there, and a species I'd really like to focus on, Eisenhardtia orthocarpa. So Eisenhardtia is a member of the legume family. I think it's a rather interesting legume. The seed pods are quite different from things like mesquite or palo verde. This is another shot from the Tumacacori Mountains looking south. If you look closely towards the bottom left corner, you can see Amaruxia, which Wendy talked about and described its fantastic edible qualities. This is Palmatifida, the more common species. Now, this Eisenhardtia can be a small shrub to a large tree. We can see this is not a full map of its distribution. It does go a little further south. So this is a plant with a strong kind of subtropical Madrean influence that hits its northernmost limit around Tucson. You'll find it in the Rincon Mountains, and there is a collection from Sabino Canyon as well. And it really defines the western limit of the skylands. You can see it's in the Balbachivries, and again, that blue triangle that's kind of in the bottom left there is in that Sierra El Humo. Here are some close-ups. Obviously, we'll be hearing much more about this on the third night from Jillian Coles, excuse me, but we can see some fantastic pollinator relationships here. This is a Lycus beetle, Lycus arizonensis, I believe, but perhaps Jillian could correct me. Really beautiful beetle that I've observed in multiple mountain ranges associated with the Eisenhardtia species. You can also see a bee there with its prominent pollen sacs on the legs, grabbing nectar from these flowers as well. In the photo on the left here, we can see another beetle. I'm not sure the identification on that one. And we can see a photo of the seed. So this is where the specific epithet orthocarpa comes from. These are straight tooth-shaped seed pods. Again, really much more diminutive than some of the other legumes like mesquite or palo verde. I'd like to move now into perhaps my favorite habitat, which is the semi-desert into grassland into just grassland. Now, this is a photo by my friend Luke Swenson, whom I'm working on a project in the Atascosas. It's called the Atascosa Borderlands, and it is more of a land use history that involves some of this floral work. This photo is looking towards Atascosa Peak, which is the prominent peak in the background there. We can see Ruby Road, and for those who asked about where Sycamore Canyon was, it's just down out of sight, kind of between Atascosa Peak and where this photo was taken in Bear Valley. This is another habitat photo, this one from the Canelo Hills, of a beautiful grassland with, especially in the lower points, some oak woodland mixed in, and another photo from the Canelo Hills. We can see one of the most recognizable grassland species, Bouteloua curtipingula, kind of dominating in the foreground there. So the species I'd like to focus on is actually not a grass, but is another monocot altogether, and one that Wendy actually touched on, Yucca baccata variety brevifolia. I tend to agree with Wendy that I think it could be treated as a separate species split from baccata, the Arizonica. This is near Peña Blanca Lake, also in the Atascosa Mountains. It's a beautiful, beautiful yucca. It's quite different from baccata variety baccata, largely in that it is caulescent, so somewhat trunk forming, whereas baccata variety baccata is acaulescent, so always kind of on the ground. We can see a photo of the 6 tepals, which are united petals and sepals. We can see the stamens, and then we can see the beautiful pistil there, which, as Wendy mentioned, and as we'll hear more from Jillian, is where the Tegaticula moths will deposit their eggs. So this is one of the only known instances of intentional pollination of a plant by an insect, and makes it well worth our study. Here's a distribution map, and this one's handy because aside from the more coastal populations northwest of Hermosillo, this is another plant that kind of helps us define the limits of what I would consider the skyline region. Northernmost populations will occur around the Pinal Mountains, maybe a little bit north, and then south towards the southern end of the Sky Islands, where they start really turning more into the Sierra Madre. Here's some more photos showing that bacate fruit, and a close-up of the leaves showing the margins, which, you know, is probably one of the factors that has it lumped in with baccata. There are some factors about this plant that I think make it worthy of potentially reevaluating the nomenclature. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about, and that I briefly mentioned earlier, is that these concentric rings of habitat are not necessarily true once you get on the ground. You'll see quite a bit of gradation between grassland and oak woodland. This is another photo by Luke Swenson. You can see a strong grassland influence, and then you can see oaks coming down from the shadier, that would be an east-facing side of the canyon, kind of merging towards the canyon bottom. Here's another photo. This is from Peña Blanca Canyon. This is actually looking, this is right just on the north side of the border, looking into Mexico, actually. And again, you can see that on this more northern facing slope, there is quite a bit of oak woodland. It turns more into semi-desert grassland, largely in this case dominated by Malinus repens, a very common non-native grass that's just super widespread and exposed slopes in our grassland habitats in the Sky Islands. Here's a photo as you move more into like a true oak woodland. This is actually from that same canyon, Peña Blanca Canyon. And there's several species of oaks. There's also Fraxinus velutina. Just a beautiful, beautiful canyon. I'd like to focus on, as not one of the more, it's Quercus toomii. This is literally the favorite individual of this plant. This is actually in Sycamore Canyon, so you might recognize this individual. And if you go to Sycamore, it stands out. I think it's just a beautiful natural arrangement, and I love the seedling coming up just underneath. It's quite lovely. Here are some close-ups of the top and underside of the leaves. You can see it is not going to have highly serrate margins, though as with all oaks, there's quite a bit of plasticity within the species. That is to say, there can be quite a bit of diversity within species groups. And also, as many of you know, the oaks are prone to hybridization, but this is Quercus toomii foliage. Here's a range map here, which shows that it has a much stronger Madrean influence, doesn't reach the northernmost Sky Islands, seems to largely terminate in the rincons, more common as you move into the borderlands, and plenty of populations in the Chiricahuas as well. Now, I'm going to actually focus on a second oak woodland species, because this is another, maybe my second favorite habitat, and there's such beautiful species. This is Troisia dumosa. This case variety mollis. I will show a picture of the other variety found in Arizona. Formerly, these were their own species, but they've since been lumped in with dumosa, which you also find in Texas. This is a member of the Rutaceae, so the citrus family. And if you were to smell the foliage, you could really see why it's a member of that family. Very, very strong scent. The flowers also have a very similar aroma to like orange blossoms. This is another couple of photos from Sycamore Canyon. The variety is actually pretty low isolate to the into mountains. As you move away from these mountains, you're more likely to run into variety Arizonica. Another big difference is that variety mollis tends to be found in these really shady woodlands. Variety Arizonica, typically more open slopes. So we can actually see the much less hirsute, much more glabrous leaves of Arizonica. This is a picture from Atascosa Lookout, a former fire lookout near Atascosa Peak, famously inhabited briefly by Edward Abbey. And again, we can see seed pods and the much more hirsute foliage of variety mollis in Sycamore Canyon as well. This is a really beautiful, beautiful species. It can be difficult to catch it in bloom, but there's nothing quite like it lighting up a hillside. As you move out of oak woodlands, you'll start to find yourself in additional gradations that are again heavily influenced by slope aspect. So you'll find yourself going from oak woodland to oak juniper woodland to oak pine woodland to pine oak woodland, and then maybe firmly into pine woodland. Though again, there will be uneven gradations depending on slope aspect and a variety of other factors, including soil types. Pines focus on is Pinus ingle, commonly known as the patchen. photos was taken at the Chiricahuas, and I really like it because it shows the several phases that this plant goes through as it matures. We can see there's the, above the name there, the grass stage. So in this stage, which can last for several years, I think, up to a decade or potentially more, probably more common would be about 5 to 7 years. This plant is not growing much in height, but is developing quite a robust root system. Also, because of the grassy foliage protecting the apical meris, invincible to fire. So this is a great strategy for this species. From there, they'll move up into a stage where they're going to start developing more of a trunk. They won't have heavy branching yet. At that stage, these Pinus engelmannii almost resemble yuccas. They're very Dr. Seussian for sure. At this stage, they are a little more vulnerable to fire because the trunk hasn't thickened yet. They'll move into a taller sapling stage, at which point the plant will begin putting on quite a bit of height and thickening its trunk, which will make it more resistant to fire. Finally, you'll get a mature stage. At this point, the plant's a very thick bark, which helps, again, with fire resistance. And they're just stunningly beautiful pine trees. Again, the Chiricahuas, these are from Cave Creek, would be a great place to see these. Here's a distribution map, again, showing the strongly Madrean influence of this plant. I mean, it goes quite far south and, again, terminates actually just south of Tucson. So Santa Rita's, Chiricahuas, really Huachucas, and this is just a fantastic pine species. Not at all common, but if you're hanging around in the southern end of the US Sky Islands and you're up high enough, then you will very likely run into it. Here are another couple photos of that plant because I'm just so fond of it. We can see the strobili of this plant, which are just beautiful and incredible design. And then we can see another couple of sort of smaller, we'll call them teen year Pinus engelmannii in habitat there with oaks and pine species. And we can see pinyon grass, the grass, a beautiful, beautiful species. I'd also like to focus on a species which is not showing up on the slides, Conifer alpina. That is actually a holoparasite, so it's parasitic on the roots of pines, junipers, cypress. We do get the distribution map, so at least you can see that. And I highly recommend you Google Conifer alpina to see that species. It's quite beautiful. There it is. So you got chloral, and it's quite common times of year. I suspect it's vastly under collected because it is so limited in terms of when you're likely to see it. But if you see what look like white pine cones sticking out of the ground, take a closer look. Let's see if the first series of photos are. So we can actually see that despite not having chlorophyll, they are a plant that does receive visits from pollinators. I observed bees and flies visiting the flowers. So this is a cool species that might go unnoticed unless you're looking closely. And though we tend to have a narrow-minded view of parasitic plants, it plays an important role in the ecology of these areas where it occurs. And finally, you will move more out of this pine woodland into, at some of the higher skylands, mixed conifer forest. So this is a view looking north from the Catalina Mountains. An important thing to note about these mixed conifer forests is that they also contain a large number of broadleaf or hardwood species. So we can see Quercus gamblii, the Gamble's oak, we can see trembling aspen, and we can see maple. These would be important indicators that you're moving kind of up to the upper limits of pine and into mixed conifer forest. And as a native-born Washingtonian, I have to focus on Pseudotsuga menziesii. Not only does it have one of my favorite names, but it's just a beautiful tree that I'm so used to seeing growing up. I always find it incredible to go to the top of one of these sky islands and be able to find a species that's so common there in Washington. And one of the great ways to recognize it is the cones here, which are quite distinctive. Here's a map of the local distribution. So will only be found in the taller sky islands. Pinaleños, Chiricahuas, Catalinas would be good examples. And here's more of the national distribution, which again shows the strong temperate influence on the upper elevations of these sky islands, which is one of the things that just makes them so fascinatingly biodiverse.
5 minutes.
And here's pictures of the bark and another picture of the foliage. And there are a lot of threats to the sky islands. We can see this is would be a narrow threat to only a portion of the skylands, but we can see road building, which involves a lot of groundwater pumping from the border wall, also mining. Many of you might have seen the recent news article about an expansion of exploratory drilling in the Santa Ritas, also the spread of invasive species and global warming, which can lead to catastrophic fires, as we saw so recently in the Catalinas. So these are threats that will have an effect to one degree or another on our sky islands. And that's all I have for you now. So I'd love for Lynn to open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Jack. We really appreciate that. And I see your contact information there, so that's really terrific. One question we had was that you talked about Quercus tulmii, is that how you say it, tulmii, being more southern in the Sky Islands. Are there other oaks that have sort of divergent distributions within the Sky Islands that show somehow restrictions to some portions of the Sky Islands and not others?
Well, I mean, one, for instance, would be like Quercus hypoleucoides, the silverleaf oak. So that tends to be a much more temperate influenced oak. You generally will only find that at higher elevations. So it may not be present in Sky Islands that terminate or are truncated by like an oak woodland habitat. Now, for instance, in the Atascosa Highlands, where I have most of my experience, you do not find that throughout most of the range. However, it does occur in Sycamore Canyon, which supports a number of high elevation species that really are, you know, almost as low as they could possibly be. And it's fascinating because you'll see that species, and then, you know, a couple miles downstream, you can run into saguaros, which is just fascinating. So there will be, you know, habitat specific distribution. There will be oaks that are more influenced, like Campbell's oak, by temperate habitats, and others more influenced by Madrean habitats. Thanks for the question.
Another question, and this applies to Sycamore Canyon, and I think it's probably a little confusing because we've been visiting Southern Arizona in this portion of the webinar, but there's a Sycamore Canyon near Phoenix as well. So one person asked, where exactly is Sycamore Canyon? Can you clarify that for our listeners who might want to know?
Great asking. I do not know if there is a big mountain range in Arizona that does not have a Sycamore Canyon. It seems to be ubiquitous. Anytime there's a sycamore, somebody has to name after it. This particular canyon is the same one that Carnahan was describing in the Pajarito Mountains, which are on the very southern edge of the United States. It is a canyon which runs from Ruby Road, which is not too hard to find in maps. It's south of Arivaca, and runs into Mexico. So that's the Sycamore Canyon that Sue and I have been talking about. It's in the Pajarito Mountains, southern Arizona. That's west of Nogales. Great question.
We had another question. What makes the Tucson Mountains not a Sky Island? Why don't we consider Tucson Mountains part of the Sky Islands?
Great question. There are, you know, there is a bit of topography, certainly some elevation in the Tucson Mountains, but what you will notice about the Tucson Mountains is that there is not a significant amount of woodland on the Tucson. So there's a desert scrub community at the base, and there's more or less desert scrub at the top. There are some collections of Quercus turbinella, the scrub oak, which is kind of the lowest elevation oak. But in general, it doesn't really have what I think we could consider woodlands. Therefore, the highest elevations in the Tucsons will be able to support very similar floras to the lower elevations. So really, you know, if we're talking flora, I think we have to have at least oak woodland. Some people might be more stringent in their definitions and would actually want to only include ranges that terminate in pine oak woodland. I'll leave that for the biogeographers to argue about. Thanks for that. That's a great question.
And our last question, for Canophilus, for the root parasite, one attendee wanted to know, do we know what host plants it uses? Is it generalist or is it specific in its host plants?
Pine, cypress, juniper, maybe oaks as well. So generally it's going to be these higher elevation species. You're really only likely to find it in sort of pine, oak, maybe mixed conifer forest as well. You're not really going to find it at higher elevations where there aren't dense stands of those plants.
And I was just going to share an observation I made when I was in the Chiricahuas. I was watching a patch of Canophilus, and you showed bees pollinating it. I actually saw a hummingbird visit it, and it stood on the ground while it was foraging in the Canophilus.
Fantastic.
So it was really, really cool. So we thank you very much, Jack, for your great contribution. I think we've all learned a lot from it.